From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
It is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Ilene Cooper, author of more than 30 books for young people. Her works include both fiction and nonfiction and range from picture books to history and biography. Her readers come from all ages: preschool, middle school, high school, and I dare to say some parents too. It's hard not to fall in love with Bobby and his dog Lucy from Absolutely Lucy series, empathize with Beth from An Angel in My Pocket, admire deep truth of the Golden Rule, or excitedly follow history of young JFK. In 2007, the Illinois Reading Council named Ms. Cooper the Prairie State Award winner for excellence in writing for children. She was recognized for her body of work and for embracing the Council's promotion of lifelong literacy. Ilene Cooper has recently published A Woman in the House and Senate: How Women Came to the United States Congress, broke down barriers, and changed the country, which, according to Voice of Youth Advocates, is an empowering book for tweens and teens. What seems to best describe Ms. Cooper's works and her whole attitude towards writing are her own words. I write to open windows so young people can look at the world outside and inside themselves. So without further ado, I turn the microphone to our guest, Ms. Ilene Cooper.
Thank you. It's so exciting to be here and here in Washington talking about, is this good? About women and Congress and politics and all kinds of exciting things that happen here. I'm going to start by reading you just a little bit from the book. Imagine that you are a woman living in the United States in the 1800s. You probably don't work outside the home, but if you do, and you are married, your husband has the right to take your pay. Did your parents or relatives leave you an inheritance? Sorry, that automatically becomes your husband's property. Not married? Well, you might get to keep your own money, but you'll have a hard time earning any. There are only a few jobs open to women. You can be a teacher, perhaps, or seamstress, and with no husband and no children to take care of, many people might look down on you. You'll be called an old maid. Oh, and one more thing, you won't be able to vote. That's right. Until 1920, there was no national law that guaranteed all women in the United States the right to vote. I decided to write this book because I was interested in politics, and I was interested in women, and I was interested in women in politics. Some people start young. I was a political junkie by age 12. I kept a scrapbook of the 1960 Kennedy presidential campaign, and I stayed up longer than JFK did election night to find out whether he had been elected president. He went to bed about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I stayed up all night until I found out. I don't remember how I first discovered that the Senate employed pages, and for those of you who are too young to remember, those were kids who would run around the Senate halls and the halls of the House of Representatives and do things for the Congress people. Probably it was watching a TV run of Frank Capra's 1944 film, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I was really intrigued to see those kids bustling around the halls of Congress, while Jimmy Stewart dramatically demonstrated what a filibuster ought to look like. I must not have noticed that all the pages were boys, because I wrote my Senator Everett Dirksen asking how I could become a Senate page. The answer was short and dismissive. I couldn't. Pages were boys. As a teen, for all my interest in politics, it didn't really occur to me that a female presence wasn't just lacking in the page population. The number of women sitting in the House and Senate was almost as paltry. There was a total of 10 women representatives throughout the 1960s, and they did not all overlap. So there were over 400 Congress people, and there were 10 women. Only 2 female senators served during the decade. Oregon's Maureen Neuberger, a Democrat, and Republican Margaret Chase Smith of Maine. When I first started thinking about writing this book, I thought of it as just a simple book about profiles or firsts. I was going to start with Jeanette Rankin, who was elected to the House of Representatives from Montana in 1916, 4 years before women across the United States got the right to vote. How did that happen? Well, all across the West, in fact, women received the vote earlier than the rest of the country. Pioneer women who faced the same hardships as men felt they deserved the same privileges, and they demanded them. And Wyoming, still a territory in 1869, was the first to grant full voting rights to women. And then Colorado and Utah and Idaho and California, they followed along. So all those states had women voting before the passage of the 19th Amendment. But there were lots of firsts I wanted to write about. I wanted to introduce Patsy Mink, who was the first woman of color from Hawaii to serve in the House, and Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American Congresswoman, and Elena Ross Layton, the first female Hispanic. But the more I kept reading and the more I kept doing my research, I realized there were lots of fascinating stories about the diverse group of women from around the country who came to serve, why they ran, what they accomplished, and the lasting effect they've had on Congress and the nation. And as I began to write, I realized I had a problem. I quickly understood that it wasn't possible to string together all these profiles of all these interesting women without my readers knowing what was happening in the country at the time. For instance, Richard Nixon defeating Helen Gahagan Douglas, in part because he accused her of being pink right down to her underwear, meant nothing if readers didn't know about the 1950s Red Scare. Without understanding the civil rights movement or the women's movement, the contributions of a Barbara Jordan or a Bella Abzug would mean little. So information about what was happening in the country had to be included. My book, which was originally contracted for 48 pages, was going to become a lot longer. My editor went from understanding to alarmed and then finally resigned. And I think the book came out from the 48 page it was going to be, it ended up being 131 pages. As I did more and more research, I found another story I wanted to tell. How the women who came to Congress were received by the men who were already there. Well, early on, women might not have always been welcomed by their male counterparts, but they were mostly treated politely. Then more women started coming, though not in very big numbers. Until 1941, there were never more than 10 women in Congress at the same time. 10 women to more than 500 men. How much progress had been made by the middle of the 20th century? In 1955, 17 women were sworn into Congress. One of those was Martha Griffins, a Democrat from Michigan. On the day of the swearing in, she sat next to one of the male representatives. He glumly said, "At this rate, it won't be any time before you ladies have the majority here." Representative Griffiths couldn't believe her ears. The majority? Really? She asked the Library of Congress to figure out just how long it would take women to have the majority in Congress at the rate they were coming. The answer soon came back, 432 years. By the 1970s, though, when women were demanding their rights instead of asking for them, many congressmen were growing hostile. When Patricia Schroeder was appointed to the Armed Services Committee, the senator in charge of the committee made her and an African-American congressman, Ron Dellums, share a chair because he said women and blacks were worth only half a member. And as we learned just last week, the Senate still isn't so friendly to women. Just ask Senator Kristen Gillibrand, who was told by some of her fellow congresspeople that she needed to lose some weight after she had a baby. I guess they don't have an HR department in Congress. The more stories I learned, the more proud and respectful I became about the diverse group of women, many of them pioneers, really. But there was one story that affected me personally. The week before I graduated high school, my mother died of a heart attack. The salary she earned as a saleswoman was intended to cover my college tuition. Thankfully, it was much less in those days. Still, after she died, it seemed like college might not be in the cards for me. Then my family learned that we were entitled to her Social Security benefits. A few years earlier, this would not have been the case. A husband's Social Security benefits went to his family. A wife's were simply put back into the general fund. It took a dedicated congresswoman, that same Martha Griffiths of Michigan, to push for a bill that would reverse that injustice. In 1962, that bill became law, and because it did, I received my mother's Social Security benefits and was able to attend the University of Missouri. Learning how much I owed to a congresswoman whose name I now knew had a profound effect on me. The more I wrote, the more I realized that the women who've served in Congress have all made their marks, whether it was on domestic legislation, foreign affairs, or simply by being present, reminding the nation that women make up half the country. When I was almost done with my book at the time of the 2010 election, it looked as if I was going to have to end it on a real downer. For the first time in history, fewer women were elected to Congress than in the election before. Fortunately, I wrote very slowly, and that had turned around by 2012. A friend of mine was reading this book to her granddaughters, ages 10 and 12, and she told me they were shocked. There was a time when women couldn't vote. So that's another reason I wrote this book. Maybe the most important reason. I wrote to show how far women have come in American politics in the last 100 years. Not far enough, by far. But progress has been made. As former Senator Olympia Snowe, one of my personal champions, says in the introduction to my book, for too long, women in America had to endure the myth of what or where a woman's place should be. A woman's place is virtually anywhere, including the United States Congress. Thank you. Are there any questions? Nope. Yes, here's one.
Did you find any commonality in what got these women to be brave enough to run?
Well, it's interesting. In the very beginning, the reason that they came primarily was because their husbands died. And so for a long time, the only women who were there were filling out their husbands' terms. And then slowly, sometimes it was the daughters of people who had served in Congress for a long time who decided that they were going to serve as well. Then by the 1940s, women were coming on their own, mostly wealthy women, women who either had been active in their political parties or knew that they had the financial wherewithal to take seats. But it took a while before, except for Jeanette Rankin. And Jeanette Rankin, the first woman, had a very interesting career because she was a pacifist. And the day she came into Congress, the first time was the day that they voted on World War I. And she voted against it. The second time she came back to Congress was right after Pearl Harbor. She was the only representative as a pacifist to vote against World War II. And I believe she was in her late 80s during the Vietnam War, and she was still leading peace marches on Congress. She wasn't a representative then, but she was still staying true to her pacifist beliefs. Any other questions? Yes.
How many of the protesters against this law or like discrimination, against women were men?
Well, that's interesting because it wasn't just men. It's easy to blame the men, but a lot of this was, before the law passed, before in the 1800s, say, nobody really thought that women should have the right to vote. And so pretty universally, except for some groups of feminists, they thought, well, women just don't vote. In fact, nowhere in the world did women vote until the late 1860s. So it wasn't unusual that women weren't voting here. It was really when the pioneers went west and the women were, working alongside the men that they said, we want the same rights that the men have.
Okay.
Good question. Any other questions? No? Well, thank you. I hope to see you down. Oh, yes, we have a question.
I'm just a little bit taller. Yikes. I'm wondering, what would you like for men, fathers, grandfathers, uncles, brothers, to say to young women, to little girls, about the role of women in political society and painting a broader picture for their role in leadership?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think, first of all, it's important to know the history. I think it gives girls and women, just like my friends' granddaughters, a little extra bit of fire when they know that there was a time that they couldn't do it. Because then it's like a fight. So what do you mean we can't, we couldn't, we didn't? And I think it's just the basic encouragement that girls can do anything. And that is the most important message. And to get them involved early on, to expose them to what's going on in the political world and to enter into a dialogue with them about what do they think, should be done. What's your opinion? What do you, to help them form opinions? Because I think that's in our educational system today when it's teaching to the test and a lot of, let's learn the facts. I think what's missing is kids learning how to form opinions and think about what they think. So I think just discussion, getting involved, and telling them they can do anything, and telling them a little bit about their history. Thanks. Any other questions? Nope. Okay. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.